$12,000. That's what the letter said I owed. Additional HOA fees. Payment due in 30 days. I'd lived in Clover Creek for 15 years. I'd never missed a payment. I read the letter 3 times. The amount never changed. Neither did the address. So I called Winona Kerr, the HOA president. "There's a mistake," I said. She laughed. I started explaining my payment history. She cut me off. "If $12,000 is a problem for you, maybe it's time to find a different neighborhood." I grabbed the letter, got in my truck, and drove straight to the community office. The office sat near the entrance of Clover Creek, between the clubhouse and a row of flower beds that somehow always looked perfect. I parked beside a black SUV and walked inside. Winona Kerr's office door was open. She looked up as I approached, not surprised, not concerned, as if she'd been expecting me. I dropped the letter onto her desk. $12,000. She glanced at the paper. "Yes." "You seriously expect me to pay this?" "We expect every homeowner to pay their assessment." I pulled out a chair. "There has to be a mistake." "There isn't." She didn't even look at the letter again. Not once. That bothered me more than I expected. Most people would at least pretend to review it. Winona acted like the conversation had already happened, like the decision had already been made, like my opinion wasn't part of the process. I've lived here 15 years. I'm aware. I've never missed a payment. That's good. The way she said it made it sound completely irrelevant. I leaned forward. "So, explain it to me." She folded her hands on the desk. "The association's insurance costs increased substantially. Reserve funding requirements have also changed. The board approved a special assessment." It sounded rehearsed, word for word, like she'd repeated it all morning. How does that become $12,000? The board's allocation formula. What formula? The approved formula. I stared at her. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Who created it? The board. Based on what? The community's needs. Every answer somehow avoided the question I was actually asking. I tried again. How many homeowners received assessments? Several. How many? I don't have those numbers in front of me. The folder sitting open beside her suggested otherwise. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind people use when they think they're being patient with someone slow. "If you're concerned, you're welcome to attend the next board meeting." The irritation I'd been trying to keep under control started slipping. $12,000 is more than being concerned. Winona leaned back in her chair. Clover Creek has changed a lot over the years. The comment seemed to come from nowhere. I frowned. What does that have to do with anything? She shrugged. Some homeowners adapt to change better than others. There it was. The first moment that didn't sound like insurance or reserve funds or accounting. It sounded personal. I stood. The conversation wasn't going anywhere. As I reached the door, Winona spoke again. "If $12,000 is a problem, Anna, maybe it's time to consider whether this community is still the right fit." The same line she had used on the phone, only this time she said it looking directly at me. I walked out before I said something I would regret. The parking lot looked different than it had 20 minutes earlier. Busier. 3 more trucks, 2 more cars, people standing in small groups, and almost every person I recognized was holding a white envelope. That got my attention immediately. David Mercer spotted me first. His family owned one of the oldest farms in Clover Creek. He held up his letter. "You get hit too?" 12,000. He let out a low whistle. "I'm at 10. I stopped. 10? He nodded. And before I could ask anything else, another voice joined the conversation. Mike Rollins. "Mine's 8. Mike walked over holding his own envelope. None of us looked happy. For the next 10 minutes, people kept arriving. Not dozens, just enough to notice. A cattle farmer, a hay producer, a retired couple with acreage near the creek. Every few minutes, another truck pulled in. Every few minutes, somebody stepped out carrying the same letter. At first, it felt random. Then it didn't. Because the people arriving all had something in common. Land, fields, barns, space. The older parts of Clover Creek. Nobody said it, nobody needed to. You could see it happening. The same realization moving from person to person. Then something else happened. A silver sedan pulled into the lot. Out stepped Karen Watkins. Karen lived 3 streets over from me. Large house, 3-car garage, one of the newest properties in the neighborhood. She looked confused. Not angry, just confused. David asked the obvious question. "You get one too?" Karen shook her head. "No." The conversation stopped, just for a second. "No assessment?" Mike asked. "No." "Nothing?" "Nothing." I watched her expression. She genuinely had no idea what we were talking about. David looked at me. I looked at Mike. Nobody said anything. But now we had something we didn't have before. A comparison. Karen's house was worth more than mine, worth more than David's, worth more than Mike's. Yet somehow she owed nothing. I glanced back toward the HOA office. The windows reflected the afternoon sun. You couldn't see inside. Probably for the best. Because if Winona had walked out right then, I might have asked questions she didn't want to answer. The drive home felt different. Not because I had answers, but because I had more questions. By the time I reached my farm, the assessment itself wasn't bothering me anymore. The inconsistency was. I parked beside the barn and sat in the truck for a minute. The fields stretched toward the tree line. Exactly the same as they had looked the week before. Exactly the same as they had looked the year before. Nothing out there had changed. Yet somehow Clover Creek suddenly needed millions of dollars in emergency funding? Enough to send $12,000 bills to people who had never missed a payment. That evening, I started making calls. One neighbor had received $6,000, another had received $9,000, another had received nothing. The pattern became harder to ignore with every conversation. The largest assessments weren't landing randomly. They were landing on people with acreage, people with farms, people with larger pieces of land, people whose families had been part of Clover Creek long before the neighborhood became desirable. Around sunset, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. Names, addresses, assessment amounts. Nothing complicated, just facts. By the time darkness settled over the farm, one thing was obvious. The numbers didn't make sense. The formula didn't make sense. And Winona's attitude definitely didn't make sense. If this was really about insurance, why couldn't anyone explain it? If this was really about reserve funding, why were some homeowners paying nothing? And if everyone was supposed to share responsibility equally, why did the people with the most land seem to be carrying the heaviest burden? I looked out the kitchen window toward the fields. For 15 years, Clover Creek had felt like a place where farmers and homeowners simply lived alongside each other. That night, for the first time, it felt like somebody was trying to decide which group belonged there in the future. And I had a feeling the $12,000 was only the beginning. By the next morning, I had 15 names written across a legal pad. 15 addresses, 15 assessment amounts, and not a single explanation that made sense. The board kept repeating the same words: insurance, reserve funding, community responsibility. But the numbers weren't behaving the way those explanations should have. David Mercer had been assessed $10,000. Mike Rollins had been assessed $8,000. Harold Jensen had been assessed $14,000. Meanwhile, Karen Watkins, who lived in one of the newest homes in Clover Creek, had received nothing at all. Neither had several of her neighbors. That bothered me more than the amount on my own letter. If the community faced a financial crisis, everyone should have been carrying part of the burden. Instead, the burden seemed to be landing in very specific places. I spent most of Thursday making calls. Then Friday. Every conversation added another piece to the picture. A retired couple with acreage had received $9,000. A cattle farmer near the western boundary had received $11,000. A family that owned 20 acres near the creek had received $12,000. A newer resident with a large custom-built home received nothing. Another received nothing. Then another. The pattern wasn't complete yet, but it was becoming difficult to ignore. The assessment seemed less connected to home values and more connected to land itself, especially working land, especially farms. By Friday afternoon, the letters had become the main topic of conversation throughout Clover Creek. People talked about them in parking lots, at church, at local businesses, at gas stations. Not because everyone had received one, because nobody understood why some people had and others hadn't. Questions spread faster than answers, and answers were in short supply. The HOA office had become noticeably harder to reach. Calls went to voicemail, emails received generic responses, requests for clarification were acknowledged but rarely answered. The board seemed willing to discuss the existence of the assessment, not the logic behind it. Saturday morning, I stopped at Rollins Feed Supply. I only needed a box of staples for a fence repair. Instead, I walked into what looked like an unofficial town meeting. David was there, Mike was there, Harold Jensen was standing near the front counter. 2 other farm owners were comparing letters beside a pallet of livestock feed. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had announced it. The same thing had simply happened to enough people. For nearly an hour, we compared amounts, property sizes, locations, anything that might explain the differences. The more information we gathered, the stranger it became. One homeowner with 15 acres owed nearly $10,000. Another with a similar property owed less than half. A third owed even more. No formula seemed to fit. No explanation worked. Then Harold mentioned his daughter. She owned a townhouse near the clubhouse. Same HOA, same roads, same entrance, same community. Her assessment was 0. The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at him. Nothing? David asked. Harold shook his head. Not $1. Nobody knew what to say after that, because for the first time, the issue felt larger than money. The board wasn't simply collecting funds. They were deciding who would provide them. That distinction mattered a lot. Later that afternoon, residents received an email announcing an informational session. Not a board meeting, not a vote, just an opportunity for residents to hear more about the assessment. The wording immediately rubbed people the wrong way. Most homeowners weren't looking for information anymore. They were looking for answers. By Monday evening, the community room was full. Every chair was occupied, people lined the walls, others stood in the hallway. The mood felt very different from the usual HOA gatherings. Normally, people complained about landscaping, parking, mailbox colors. This was different. This involved real money. Winona stood at the front, beside a projector screen. 3 board members sat behind her, stacks of documents covered the table. She looked completely comfortable, almost too comfortable. The presentation began with insurance costs, reserve fund projections, maintenance obligations, future liabilities. Slide after slide filled with numbers. 20 minutes passed, then 25. People kept waiting for the explanation. It never came. Eventually, a homeowner raised his hand. His question was simple. How were the assessments calculated? Winona smiled politely. The board isn't required to justify every calculation to every homeowner. The room immediately became quieter. Not calmer, quieter. The difference matters. People weren't reassured, they were surprised. Another homeowner asked why some properties received no assessment at all. Winona answered that the board had used multiple factors. When asked what those factors were, she declined to elaborate. A third homeowner asked why agricultural properties seemed to be paying more. That question finally changed her tone. Only slightly, but enough. Clover Creek can't move forward if a handful of property owners insist on living in the past. The room went silent. Nobody needed clarification. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. The farm owners, the families that had lived there for decades, the people sitting in the back rows. For the first time all evening, the conversation stopped being about numbers. Now it was about attitude. Winona wasn't talking like someone solving a financial problem. She was talking like someone frustrated by the people standing in her way. The rest of the meeting only made things worse. Questions went unanswered, concerns were dismissed. Residents grew visibly frustrated. One board member attempted to offer additional details. Winona interrupted him before he finished. Another homeowner requested the allocation formula. The request was denied. By the time the session ended, nobody looked satisfied. Most looked angry. Winona thanked everyone for attending, then reminded the room that payments remained due within 30 days. No extensions, no delays, no exceptions. People filed out slowly. Groups immediately formed in the parking lot. The real meeting started after the official one ended. Nobody discussed insurance anymore. Nobody discussed reserve funds. They talked about Winona. They talked about the farms. They talked about the feeling that something wasn't right. I drove home more convinced than ever that the assessment wasn't random. But conviction isn't proof. I still needed proof. That night, I sat at my kitchen table until nearly midnight. Phone beside me, legal pad in front of me. Every new assessment amount got added to the list. 20 names became 23, then 24, then 26. Eventually, I had enough information to do something I hadn't been able to do before. I sorted the assessments from highest to lowest. $14,000, farm owner. $12,000, farm owner. $11,000, farm owner. $10,000, farm owner. I kept going. 9,000, farm owner. 9,000, farm owner. 8,000, farm owner. Another 8,000, farm owner. Another farm owner. Another farm owner. I stopped, then started over. Because I honestly thought I had made a mistake. I hadn't. The 10 highest assessments in Clover Creek all belonged to farm owners. Every single one. Not 9 out of 10, not most of them, all of them. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the list. At that point, I stopped wondering whether farm owners were being hit harder than everyone else. The numbers had already answered that question. The real question was why. The week after the informational session, the assessment stopped being the biggest topic in Clover Creek. That surprised me. A few days earlier, everyone had been talking about the money, the deadlines, the amounts, the unfairness of the formula. Now the conversation was changing. People were starting to talk about the future. More specifically, whose future Winona Kerr was talking about whenever she stood in front of a microphone. The change started with a community announcement. Future of Clover Creek, open planning session. All residents welcome. The event was scheduled for Thursday evening at the clubhouse. No mention of assessments, insurance, or reserve funds. Just planning, vision, growth. The kind of language Winona loved. By then, I had started paying attention whenever those words appeared together. So had David, so had Mike, and judging by the number of trucks parked outside the clubhouse that evening, so had a lot of other people. The room filled quickly. Not because people suddenly cared about planning sessions, but because they cared about Winona. More accurately, they wanted to know what she wasn't saying. The atmosphere felt different from the assessment meeting. Less confusion, more suspicion. People had spent 2 weeks comparing numbers, comparing assessment letters, comparing stories. The pattern was no longer a secret. Everyone knew the farms had been hit the hardest. The question now was whether that had been intentional. Winona stood at the front of the room, beside a large projector screen. Confident, relaxed, completely in control. At least she looked that way. The presentation began with photographs, community entrances, walking trails, landscaping upgrades, decorative lighting. Then came artist renderings. Wide sidewalks, outdoor gathering spaces, new recreational areas. Everything looked expensive, polished, professional. It barely looked like Clover Creek. Every image seemed designed for a real estate brochure, not for the people already living there. Winona clicked through the slides one at a time, talking about opportunities, growth, long-term value, the future. Always the future, never the present, never the people sitting in front of her. About halfway through the presentation, she displayed an aerial rendering of the community. Roads, homes, green spaces, future development zones. The image remained on the screen longer than the others. And that was when people started noticing something. The farms weren't there. Not exactly. The land was there, but the farms weren't. No barns, no equipment, no livestock areas, no agricultural structures. The largest parcels looked empty, like blank spaces waiting for something else. A low murmur spread through the room. Winona ignored it, continuing to speak about property values, modern amenities, and community enhancement. Then a resident raised his hand. One simple question. Where do the farms fit into this plan? The room became completely silent. Winona stopped. For a moment, it looked like she was deciding how much honesty the audience could handle. Then she smiled. Not warmly, not politely, the same smile she used whenever she thought she was the smartest person in the room. Clover Creek cannot reach its full potential while large sections of the community remain underutilized. The silence that followed felt different, heavier. Nobody asked what she meant. Nobody needed to. Everyone knew. The farms. The room erupted into whispers. Some people looked angry, others uncomfortable, a few genuinely shocked. Winona simply waited. Like she had expected the reaction. Like she didn't care. Then another hand went up. This time it was David. He stood before asking his question, his voice calm. Those farms have been here longer than any of us. A few people nodded, others applauded quietly. Winona never changed expression, and nobody is forcing them to stay. The room exploded. Not literally, nobody shouted or threw anything, but the atmosphere changed instantly. The division that had been growing quietly for weeks suddenly became visible. People stopped whispering. Now they were talking. Some defended Winona, some defended the farms. Most simply stared because they had finally heard what many suspected. Not from rumors, not from speculation, from Winona herself. She didn't see the farms as part of Clover Creek's future. She saw them as obstacles. The board tried to regain control. One member attempted to redirect the discussion. Another suggested returning to the presentation. It didn't matter. Nobody cared about decorative lighting anymore. Nobody cared about walking trails. The room had heard the only thing that mattered. For the rest of the meeting, every question somehow returned to the same subject. The farms, property rights, development, growth. Each answer only made things worse. Not because Winona lost her temper, because she didn't. She remained calm, confident, certain. The kind of certainty that becomes infuriating when people feel ignored. By the time the meeting ended, nobody was discussing renderings. They were discussing Winona. Clusters of residents formed immediately outside the clubhouse. The parking lot became more active than the meeting itself. People compared notes, repeated her comments, argued about what she meant. Although most didn't seem interested in arguing. They seemed interested in understanding what had just happened. I found David standing beside his truck. Mike was with him. Neither spoke immediately. Neither looked surprised, just disappointed. Finally, David shook his head. I knew she didn't like the farms. Mike nodded. Yeah. Then he looked back toward the clubhouse, toward the building where Winona was still talking with board members, toward the woman who had spent weeks claiming the assessments were only about finances. Then he said something I couldn't stop thinking about. She wasn't talking about land. Nobody answered, because everyone already knew. Mike looked at me, then at David, then across the dark fields beyond the parking lot. She was talking about us. The drive home felt very different from the one after the assessment meeting. Back then, I was trying to understand the numbers. Now I was trying to understand the motive. The assessments suddenly looked different. The meetings looked different. Even Winona looked different. For weeks, I had been asking whether the farms were being targeted. After that meeting, I wasn't asking anymore. The real question had become something much larger. If Winona wanted a different Clover Creek, how far was she willing to go to get it?
Help us grow. Join to Suburban Verdict.
The morning after the planning meeting, nobody in Clover Creek was talking about the assessment formula, nobody was talking about insurance, nobody was talking about reserve funds. They were talking about Winona. More specifically, they were talking about one sentence, and nobody is forcing them to stay. The phrase spread through the community faster than the assessment letters ever had. People repeated it in parking lots, at church, at the diner, not because it was shocking, because it sounded honest. For weeks, residents had been arguing about numbers. Now they were arguing about intent. That was a much bigger problem. Once people start questioning motives, they stop trusting explanations, and trust was disappearing quickly. By Friday afternoon, David called. I talked to an attorney. That wasn't surprising. At least 5 homeowners had probably done the same thing already. What did he say? There was a brief pause. Then David gave an answer I wasn't expecting. He said the assessments might be completely legal. I leaned back in my chair. That wasn't encouraging. But the interesting part wasn't what he thought about the assessments. Now I was listening. David continued. He asked a question. What question? If the board needed money so badly, why did they choose the most divisive way possible to collect it? The question hung there. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then David added, the attorney said there were easier options. Special financing, payment plans, gradual increases, temporary assessments spread over several years. The attorney apparently listed half a dozen alternatives. The board had chosen none of them. Instead, they had sent massive bills to a relatively small group of homeowners, farm owners, the same people Winona had just publicly described as obstacles to progress. That didn't prove anything, but it created a new question. Why choose a method guaranteed to create conflict? For the next few days, that question stayed with me. The more I thought about it, the less the board's explanation made sense. If this was only about money, there were easier ways to raise money. If this was only about insurance, there were easier ways to solve insurance problems. Yet every road somehow led back to the farms. Monday afternoon, another phone call changed the conversation completely. The caller was Robert Kane. Everyone in Clover Creek knew Robert. His family had farmed the area longer than most residents had been alive. More importantly, Robert avoided HOA politics. He never attended meetings, never complained, never got involved, which made the phone call unusual. We spent a few minutes talking about the assessment situation. Then Robert asked a question. How many farms have been sold in Clover Creek recently? I honestly didn't know. A few? 3. The answer came immediately, like he had already done the math. 3 farms, all sold within the last year. I didn't understand why that mattered, at least not yet. So? Robert was quiet. Then he said something that immediately got my attention. The same investment group bought all 3. I stopped writing. What investment group? They use different company names. That wasn't unusual. Investors did that all the time. What makes you think it's the same group? I checked county records. Now I was paying attention. Not because I thought we'd uncovered some giant conspiracy, but because Robert wasn't the type to make claims he couldn't support. According to him, all 3 purchases traced back to the same parent company. Different names, different paperwork, same owner. I looked out across my fields. For the first time since receiving the assessment letter, the conversation shifted in my mind. The farms, the assessments, the planning meeting, the investors. Until that moment, those subjects had existed separately. Now they didn't. Why are investors buying farms? I asked. Robert laughed. Not because the question was funny, but because he thought the answer was obvious. Because somebody thinks the land will be worth more later. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about that statement. Worth more later. That was exactly how Winona talked. Future growth, future value, future opportunities. Everything was always about what Clover Creek could become, never what it already was. Tuesday evening, several farm owners met at a diner outside town. Nothing formal, just coffee, conversation, questions. For the first time, the discussion wasn't centered on the assessments. It was centered on the land. David brought a map. Nothing dramatic, just property boundaries, farm locations, recent sales. As we compared notes, another uncomfortable pattern started emerging. The farms receiving the highest assessments weren't random. They also happened to sit in some of the most desirable areas surrounding the newer developments. Near roads, near expanding neighborhoods, near infrastructure. Nobody jumped to conclusions. Nobody needed to. The pattern spoke for itself. By the time we left the diner, the assessment letters looked different than they had a week earlier. Not smaller, not fairer, different. Originally, they looked like bills. Then they looked like pressure. Now they looked like something else entirely. A question. Wednesday morning, I spread everything across my kitchen table. Assessment amounts, property locations, recent sales, notes from phone calls. For weeks, I had been asking why farm owners were paying more. And then I started asking why Winona seemed so eager to push them aside. Now another question was taking its place, one that felt bigger than both. Maybe Winona wanted a different Clover Creek. That part seemed obvious. But if the farms disappeared, who exactly was supposed to take their place? I stared at the 3 recently sold properties on the map. 3 farms, 3 investors, 3 purchases made before the assessment letters ever arrived. And for the first time since this started, I found myself wondering whether the most important people in the story weren't sitting on the HOA board at all. They might have been the ones quietly buying land while everyone else was arguing about assessments. The investors changed the conversation. Until Robert Kane mentioned the 3 farm sales, most of us had been focused on Winona. The meetings, the assessments, the comments, the pressure. Now another question had entered the picture. If farm owners were being pushed, who was waiting on the other side? That question followed me for days. The timing bothered me more than anything else. The farms had been sold before the assessment letters, before the public arguments, before Winona stood in front of the community and suggested some residents might not belong in Clover Creek's future. The pieces didn't fit together, at least not yet. A few days later, David called. I talked to an attorney. By that point, several homeowners probably had. Still, I wanted to hear what he found. What did he say? There was a pause. Then David laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it wasn't the answer he expected. He said the assessments might be completely legal. I leaned back in my chair. That wasn't exactly encouraging. But then he asked a question. What question? David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he repeated the attorney's words exactly. If the board needed money that badly, why did they choose the one option guaranteed to start a war? That got my attention. The attorney apparently spent 20 minutes walking through alternatives. Installment plans, multi-year assessments, temporary increases, financing options. The list went on. The board had chosen none of them. Instead, they concentrated the largest financial burden on a relatively small group of homeowners. The same group Winona seemed increasingly frustrated by, and the same group investors suddenly seemed interested in buying from. The attorney didn't accuse anyone of anything. He simply pointed out something obvious. If this was only about money, there were easier ways to collect it. That sentence stayed with me, because it created a new question. If the assessment wasn't only about money, what else was it accomplishing? The pressure inside Clover Creek continued growing. More residents submitted requests, asked questions, demanded explanations. The board responded with carefully written, professional corporate language designed to answer without actually explaining. Then Winona made another mistake. The community email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Most residents expected another update about the assessment, but instead, they received something very different. The first half looked normal: community reminders, landscaping projects, maintenance schedules. Then came the final paragraph, the paragraph everyone remembered. A small group of property owners has chosen to spread misinformation and unnecessary division throughout the community. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. She never used names, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. The farm owners, the residents asking questions, the people receiving the highest assessments. Within hours, screenshots started circulating throughout Clover Creek. The reactions came quickly, not because people suddenly agreed with the farm owners, but because they disliked being talked down to. Then residents reached the final sentence, and things became worse. Clover Creek cannot allow a handful of residents to hold the community hostage simply because they refuse to embrace change. That was the phrase people discussed all week. Not insurance, not assessments, not reserve funds. Change. Winona always came back to change. The email accomplished something none of the meetings had. It turned neutral residents into skeptics. People who had ignored the controversy now started paying attention, not because of the assessment, but because of the attitude behind it. Even some homeowners who supported the board privately admitted the email was a mistake. For the first time, Winona looked less like a leader and more like someone losing patience. The pressure continued building. A few days later, another board meeting took place. The room filled early. This time, residents weren't looking for explanations, they were looking for accountability. The meeting started normally. Budget updates, maintenance projects, routine reports. Then public comments began. The first questions focused on the assessments. Then someone asked a simple question. Did every board member support this assessment? The room became silent. Not because the question was shocking, but because nobody expected an answer. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then one of the quieter board members adjusted his microphone. The same board member who had recently stopped defending Winona in public. He looked uncomfortable. Then he spoke. Not exactly. The silence somehow became even louder. Winona immediately turned toward him. The board member stared down at his notes. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain. He simply repeated himself. Not exactly. That was all. The meeting continued, but nobody cared about the rest because something important had just happened. For months, the board had appeared united. Now, residents knew otherwise. The cracks were finally visible. A few days later, the attorney received part of the information he had requested. Not everything, just enough to review. That evening, David and I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Assessment records, property numbers, parcel maps. Most of it looked painfully boring until we started comparing locations. Then the pattern appeared, again and again. The highest assessments weren't randomly distributed across Clover Creek. They clustered around specific areas, near expanding developments, near newer neighborhoods, near roads, near locations investors would consider valuable. I stared at the maps for a long time. Winona kept talking about people. The assessments kept pointing toward land. The investors kept buying property. And the more we looked, the harder it became to separate those things. For weeks, I thought the conflict was between Winona and the farm owners. Looking at those maps, I started wondering if that was only part of the story. Because if investors wanted the land and Winona wanted the farms gone, those might not have been separate problems at all. They might have been the same one. The maps stayed on my kitchen table for 3 days. Every time I walked past them, I stopped. Not because they answered anything, but because they didn't. The highest assessments still clustered around the same areas. The farms investors seemed interested in were still sitting in the same locations. And Winona was still talking about growth, change, and the future. The pieces felt connected, but I couldn't prove it. The more I thought about it, the more one question bothered me. What if I was wrong? For weeks, I had assumed the insurance crisis was little more than an excuse. The assessments felt so targeted that it was easy to believe the financial emergency itself wasn't real. But assumptions have a way of becoming blind spots. By Thursday morning, I wanted an answer. Not from Winona, not from the board, but from someone whose job was understanding HOA finances. David gave me a name, an insurance broker who had worked with homeowner associations for years. No connection to Clover Creek, no connection to the board. Exactly the person I needed. His office sat outside Charlotte in a small professional building that looked completely ordinary. I explained everything. The assessments, the insurance explanation, the reserve fund concerns, the growing conflict. Then I handed him the documents. He spent several minutes reviewing them. No reaction, no surprise, no dramatic expression. When he finally looked up, his first sentence caught me completely off guard. Your insurance costs really did explode. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. Then he showed me the numbers. Premium increases, coverage changes, regional storm losses, market adjustments. According to him, homeowner associations across the state were dealing with the same problem. The increase was real. Not exaggerated, not invented. Real. That wasn't the answer I expected. Part of me had hoped the insurance story would collapse the moment somebody independent reviewed it. Instead, it survived. Then things became worse. The broker flipped to another page. The reserve fund is a bigger problem. I frowned. Bigger than the insurance increase? He nodded. Much bigger. The reserve fund hadn't become underfunded overnight. It had happened slowly, year after year, board after board, budget after budget. The problem existed long before Winona, long before the assessments, long before anyone started talking about investors. It had simply been ignored until it couldn't be ignored anymore. I sat there quietly while he explained it, because every answer seemed to remove another piece of my theory. The insurance crisis was real. The reserve fund crisis was real. The HOA genuinely needed money. None of that made me feel better. If anything, it made the situation more confusing. Because if Winona wasn't lying about the problem, why did everything still feel wrong? The meeting was ending when the broker said something that stopped me. I've seen communities in worse shape. I turned back. What happened? They fixed it. I waited. The broker leaned back in his chair. Then he gave me the sentence that stayed with me for the rest of the day. They just didn't fix it like this. That was it. No speech, no accusation, no theory. Just a simple observation. Communities with worse finances existed. Larger insurance increases existed. Weaker reserve funds existed. Yet somehow they hadn't ended up at war with their own residents. The drive back to Clover Creek felt very different. For weeks, I had been trying to prove the crisis was fake. Now, I knew it wasn't. The money was needed. The question was no longer why the HOA needed money, but why Winona had decided to collect it this way. Friday evening brought another board meeting. The room filled early. Word about the insurance broker hadn't spread, but frustration had. People were tired of vague answers, tired of emails, tired of explanations that never quite explained anything. Questions started almost immediately. Most focused on the assessments, others on transparency. Then one resident asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why are the highest assessments concentrated around farmland? The room went quiet. Winona didn't hesitate. Those properties place unique demands on the community. Confused looks spread across the room. Even people who supported the board seemed unsure what that meant. Farm owners maintained most of their own infrastructure, their own roads, their own fences, their own equipment. The explanation didn't land. A second resident raised a hand. What unique demands? For the first time all evening, Winona looked irritated. Only for a second. Then she answered. Properties that resist modernization inevitably create costs for everyone else. The room froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The statement landed exactly the way she intended and exactly the way she shouldn't have. Because suddenly the conversation wasn't about insurance or reserve funds or budgets anymore. Now it was about modernization. The same word she used in every presentation. The same word she used in every vision statement. The same word she always seemed to connect to the farms. Across the room, one board member stared at the table. Another looked toward the back wall. Nobody rushed to support her. Nobody expanded on the explanation. For the first time, Winona sounded less convincing than the people questioning her. The meeting eventually moved on, but nobody forgot the answer. By the time I got home, residents were already repeating it. Properties that resist modernization. I spread everything across the kitchen table one more time. The maps, the assessment records, the broker's notes, the board statements, the investor purchases. For weeks, I had treated all of it like one problem. Now I wasn't so sure. The financial crisis was real. The insurance problem was real. The reserve fund problem was real. The broker had confirmed all of that. But staring at the maps that night, I kept coming back to the same thought. The crisis explained why Clover Creek needed money. It still didn't explain why the same properties kept ending up in the crosshairs. And the more answers I found, the more that question refused to go away. Because if the assessments were really about money, the pattern made no sense. But if they were about something else, the pattern was starting to make perfect sense. The phrase stayed with me longer than it should have. Properties that resist modernization inevitably create costs for everyone else. That was what Winona had said. Not insurance, not reserve funds, not assessments, modernization. The more I thought about it, the stranger it sounded. Because every time someone asked about money, Winona eventually started talking about the future. Growth, development, vision, progress. The words changed, the message didn't. A few days after the meeting, David called. I think you should talk to someone. Who? A realtor. I wasn't sure what a realtor had to do with HOA assessments. Apparently David wasn't sure either, but he had been asking questions around town, and one name kept coming up. Rebecca Sloan. She had been selling property across the county for almost 20 years. Not a farm owner, not an HOA resident, not involved in the dispute. Exactly the kind of person I preferred talking to. By that point, I trusted neutral people more than anyone else. We met her at a small real estate office just outside Clover Creek. I brought copies of the maps, the assessment records, the list of recently sold farms. Nothing secret, nothing dramatic, just information. Rebecca spent several minutes looking through everything. The longer she looked, the quieter she became. Then she placed one finger on the map. These aren't random properties. I glanced at David, then back at her. What do you mean? She turned the map toward us. One by one, she pointed at the farms carrying the largest assessments, the properties investors had already purchased, and several newer developments. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. Not because it was hidden, but because nobody had shown it to us this way before. The farm sat between existing development and future development, like pieces on a board. Rebecca looked up. If growth keeps moving in this direction, these properties become extremely valuable. Nobody spoke. We already knew what the next question was. Valuable to who? Developers. The answer came instantly. Not investors. Developers. There was a difference. Investors bought land. Developers transformed it. Rebecca stood and walked toward a large county map hanging on the wall. 10 years ago, very few people were interested in this land. Today, they're building closer to it every year. Another movement, another subdivision, another development, another neighborhood. The pattern looked familiar because it was the same pattern we had been seeing on our maps. Then she smiled. Not because the situation was funny, but because to her, it was obvious. 10 years from now, they'll be fighting over it. Nobody said anything for a moment. The room suddenly felt smaller. For weeks, I had been looking at assessments. Rebecca was looking at value. Those weren't the same thing, and yet they seemed to keep leading to the same places. Before we left, I asked one final question. If you wanted to build a high-end community around Clover Creek, where would you start? She didn't even look at the map. The farms. The answer came too fast, like she'd known it before I finished speaking. The farms have the space. They also have something developers can't create. What? Location. The drive home felt strangely familiar, almost identical to the drive back from the insurance broker. Another expert, another answer, another piece of the puzzle. And somehow, the picture kept getting worse. That evening, an email from the HOA appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, Clover Creek Forward Initiative. Inside were new renderings, new concepts, new community improvements. Walking trails, lawn-scaped entrances, decorative gathering areas, enhanced amenities. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked modern. I scrolled through the presentation twice, then a third time. Something felt familiar. I opened the brochure I had received weeks earlier, the one sitting on my kitchen table since the assessments arrived. Side by side, the documents looked almost identical. The same vision, the same language, the same future. Then I noticed something. Not what was included, what wasn't. No farms, no barns, no fields, no livestock, no agricultural land. Nothing. Page after page showed the future of Clover Creek. And somehow, people like David weren't in it. Mike wasn't in it. Harold wasn't in it. I wasn't in it. The farms occupied thousands of acres around the community, yet they might as well not have existed. For several minutes, I sat there looking between the maps and the renderings. Then I realized something that should have been obvious much earlier. Winona wasn't describing the Clover Creek that existed. She was describing the Clover Creek she wanted. And those weren't necessarily the same place. The insurance crisis was real. The reserve fund crisis was real. The need for money was real. I believed all of that now. But sitting alone at my kitchen table, I started wondering if those problems were doing something else. Something Winona had never openly admitted. For months, I thought she was trying to solve a financial problem. Now I wasn't so sure. Because every version of Clover Creek she showed the community looked complete, finished, successful, modern. There was only one thing missing. Us. The Clover Creek Forward Initiative was supposed to unite the community. Instead, it did the opposite. The renderings looked impressive, the presentations looked professional, the language sounded optimistic. Future growth, community enhancement, long-term value, modernization. The same words appeared over and over again. The problem wasn't the presentation. The problem was timing. The assessments had arrived first. The questions had arrived second. Now every new proposal was being viewed through a different lens. People weren't looking at the renderings, they were looking at the land behind them. The conversation started quietly, at mailboxes, in parking lots, after church, at the feed store. Simple questions kept appearing. Why were the largest assessments concentrated around farmland? Why had investors started buying farms before the assessments? Why did every future vision seem to exclude the families already living there? Questions became more questions, and nobody seemed willing to answer them. At the next board meeting, attendance reached a level one had never seen before. Every seat was occupied. People lined the walls. Others stood near the back. The meeting began normally. Budget reports, maintenance updates, committee announcements. Nobody cared. Everyone was waiting for public comments. When the moment finally arrived, the questions came immediately. The first resident asked about the assessments. The second asked about investor purchases. The third asked why farmland kept appearing at the center of every discussion. Winona answered each question the same way she always did. Growth, vision, planning, modernization. Then an older resident stood. Not a farm owner, not someone involved in any of the disputes, just a homeowner. He looked directly at the board. Why weren't homeowners told about any of this earlier? For the first time all evening, Winona hesitated. Only briefly. Then she smiled. Long-term planning can be difficult for some residents to fully understand until they see the complete picture. The room became very quiet. Several people exchanged looks, others folded their arms, a few shook their heads. The resident sat down without saying another word. But the damage was done. Winona thought she was defending herself. Instead, she had insulted half the room. The meeting continued. More questions, more frustration. Then something happened that surprised everyone. One of the board members adjusted his microphone. The same board member who had previously answered not exactly when asked whether the assessments had unanimous support. He cleared his throat, then spoke. I think homeowners deserve more information than we've provided so far. Nobody moved. The statement wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight because it came from inside the board. Winona turned toward him immediately. For the first time, she looked genuinely caught off guard. The board member continued. I believe additional documentation should be made available to residents. Silence. Then another board member nodded. Just once. A small movement, but everyone saw it. The crack that had appeared weeks earlier was getting wider. The discussion changed after that. The room no longer felt divided between farm owners and the board. Now it felt divided between people asking questions and people avoiding them. And that was a much bigger problem for Winona. The turning point came near the end of the meeting. A homeowner stood and proposed something simple, an independent review of the assessment process. Nothing extreme, nothing hostile, just a review. A chance for residents to see everything clearly. The proposal received immediate support around the room, far more support than anyone expected, including Winona. She reached for the microphone. For the first time all evening, frustration showed on her face. The board isn't going to govern this community by referendum. The room went silent. Winona looked around the room, then added one final sentence. Leadership sometimes requires making decisions people don't understand yet. Nobody responded. Nobody needed to, because that was exactly the problem. For months, Winona had controlled every conversation inside Clover Creek. She decided what was discussed, she decided what mattered, she decided which questions deserved answers. That night felt different. For the first time, residents weren't asking what Winona wanted. They were asking whether she should still be the person making those decisions. The independent review took almost a month. By the time the results arrived, most of Clover Creek had already made up its mind. The review confirmed what many of us already suspected. The insurance crisis was real, the reserve fund problem was real, the HOA genuinely needed money. But it also found something else. The board couldn't adequately explain why similar properties had received dramatically different assessments, and nobody could provide a clear justification for why farmland had repeatedly ended up carrying some of the largest burdens. That was enough. Not because it proved corruption, not because it proved some secret conspiracy, because it proved something much simpler. The people making the decisions couldn't properly explain them. The final community meeting filled every seat, just like the last one, maybe more. Nobody came to hear about insurance. Nobody came to hear about reserve funds. People came because they wanted to know what happened next. Winona sat at the front of the room, calm, confident, exactly as she always had. When her turn came, she stood and approached the microphone. The room went quiet. Clover Creek can't keep making decisions based on what this community used to be. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Winona continued. We need to start making decisions based on what it can become. There it was. Not insurance, not budgets, not assessments. The future. The same future she had been talking about since the beginning. The same future where farms never seemed to appear. For months, Winona had tried to frame the argument as a financial issue. Standing there, she finally made it clear it was something else. The room stayed silent. Not because people agreed, because they didn't. When the moderator asked whether anyone else wanted to speak, I stood. I hadn't planned to, but after everything that had happened, there was really only one thing left to say. Nobody asked for special treatment. The room remained still. We just asked to be treated the same. Then I sat down. That was it. No speech, no applause, nothing dramatic. Nothing else needed to be said. A short time later, the vote was held. When it ended, Winona no longer had majority support on the board. Months of questions, months of pressure, months of defending decisions she couldn't fully explain. It had finally caught up with her. She gathered her papers, stood, and walked out. No argument, no final statement, no dramatic exit. Just a door closing behind her. A few months later, I found the original assessment letter in a kitchen drawer. The same letter that started everything. $12,000, additional HOA fees, payment due in 30 days. I stood there holding it for a minute. Then I walked to the window. Outside, the farm looked exactly the same. The barn, the fences, the fields, everything Winona insisted belonged to Clover Creek's past. I looked at the letter one last time, then tossed it into the trash. The farm stayed. Winona didn't.